Hello everyone, welcome to Lesson 4, Differentiating Inductive and Deductive Reasoning. For today's lesson, we're going to learn about two ways of reasoning, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. We will learn what they mean, how they are different, and how to identify them using examples. Let's get started. But before we start, let's look at our objectives for today's lesson. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to first identify whether a statement uses inductive or deductive reasoning, and second, compare and explain the differences between inductive and deductive reasoning. As we go through our lesson, try to remember the direction of each type of reasoning because this will help you identify them easily. Before we talk about inductive and deductive reasoning, let's first understand what is logical reasoning. Logical reasoning is our ability to draw a conclusion based on evidence or stated assumptions. In simple words, we look at the information we have and then we use that information to come up with a conclusion. There are two important terms that we need to understand. The first one is conclusion. A conclusion is the final result after an experiment or observation. The second one is assumption. An assumption is a statement that we temporarily consider to be true. So basically, we use information, observations, or assumptions to arrive at a conclusion. Now let's look at the two types of reasoning we will study today. There are two types of logical reasoning that we will focus on today. The first is deductive reasoning. The second is inductive reasoning. Although both involve reaching a conclusion, they work in different directions. Let's start with deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning means starting with a general rule or principle and using it to reach a specific conclusion. Again, general rule to a specific conclusion. We begin with something that is generally true and then we apply it to a particular situation. This is also called top-down logic because we move from a general idea down to a specific example. Here are some examples or an example of deductive reasoning. As we look at this example, again, remember our pattern. General to specific. You start with the general rule and then apply it to a particular case. First example. The general premise says all bachelors are unmarried men. This is our general rule. Now, we have a specific example. John is an unmarried man. Based on the general rule and the specific information about John, we can say, therefore, John is a bachelor. Let's look at what happened. We started with a general statement, all bachelors are unmarried men. Then, we applied the idea to a specific person, John. So our reasoning goes general to specific. Therefore, this is deductive reasoning. Another example. Our general rule is all numbers ending in 0 or 5 are divisible by 5. Now, let's look at our specific numbers. 135. Both numbers end in either 0 or 5. So, based on our general rule, we can conclude 135 are divisible by 5. Notice the direction again. We started with a general rule. Then, we applied that rule to specific numbers. Therefore, this is deductive reasoning. Again, if we're going from general rule to specific, that is deductive reasoning. Let's move on to inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning works in the opposite direction of deductive reasoning. Instead of starting with a general rule, we start with specific observations or examples. Then based on those observations, we form a general conclusion. So the direction is specific to general. This is also called down-top logic because we move from specific observations toward a general idea. Let's look at some examples. Again, if inductive reasoning, we start with a specific example or a specific observation, then form a general conclusion from them. Here's our first example. The specific observation says, all of my siblings are left-handed, and we are all talented artists. From this observation, we arrive at the conclusion, People that are left-handed are more creative and artistically inclined than those that are right-handed. Let's break this down. We first observed something specific. The speaker's siblings are left-handed and talented artists. Then, we used that observation to make a general conclusion about left-handed people. So our direction is specific to general. Therefore, this is an example of inductive reasoning. So important reminder, this type of reasoning is based on observations. So the general conclusion is not necessarily true in every situation. Now that we understand both types of reasoning, let's compare them. The main question you should ask yourself is, where did the reasoning start? Did it start with a general rule? Or did it start with a specific observation? Here is the easiest way to remember the difference. For deductive reasoning, general to specific. We start with a general rule or principle and apply it to a specific case. For inductive reasoning, we start with a specific observation and use them to form a general conclusion, specific to general. Deductive reasoning uses facts or general principles, while inductive reasoning uses patterns and observations. Deductive reasoning is associated with verification, while inductive reasoning is associated with discovery. Use an easy way to remember them. Deductive, general to specific. Inductive, specific to general. If you remember those two directions, you can easily identify which type of reasoning is being used. Now, let's apply what we have learned through an activity called Reasoning Writers. Here are the instructions and guidelines for your activity. Create 3 inductive and 3 deductive arguments related to school life, community or barangay situations, or a subject you're studying, math, science, social studies, etc. Each argument should be 2 to 3 sentences. Label each as inductive or deductive. For inductive, start with specific observations and end with a general or predictive conclusion. For deductive, start with a general rule or fact, then apply it to a specific case. And that's it for today's lesson. I hope you now have a clearer understanding of inductive and deductive reasoning. Thank you for watching, everyone. See you in our next lesson.